Welcome all to Whispers in the Dark, where shadows breathe and forgotten voices stir. Step beyond the veil and lose yourself in a realm where reality fractures and nightmares whisper lullabies. Here we conjure true psychological thrillers, haunted tales, and horror stories that burrow deep beneath your skin and nestle in the quiet corners of your mind. Each story crackles like old film reels, unspooling secrets too heavy for daylight. Whether it's the slow unraveling of a fractured psyche or the cold caress of something unseen lurking just behind you, we promise narratives that will haunt you long after the final word is spoken. So get ready, dim the lights, slip on your headphones and listen closely for the whispers in the dark, and subscribe if you dare to return.
It was the kind of darkness that feels older than the earth, an ancient pitch that devours even the faint memory of light. And at 3:33 a.m., somewhere on a lonely stretch of Midwestern asphalt that felt more like a vein through an endless corpse than a highway, I was gripping the wheel of my semi with both hands, slick from sweat. My boy half asleep in the passenger seat, with his head tilted against the cold window, and our old shepherd Mix curled between the seats, ears twitching like he'd been listening to a frequency I couldn't hear, his breathing low and uneasy. The road was quiet except for the rhythmic thrum of the tires, that hypnotic cadence that makes you forget the world outside, until the beam of my headlights reached forward into the fog and caught something in mid-step, and for a heartbeat I thought it was a deer, until it moved in a way that obliterated the word animal from my mind forever. Its limbs were too long, its elbows bending wrong, its spine arching like a centipede's, but human in outline, and its head. God, its head was human too, but the skin hung slack over the cheekbones, as if it had been borrowed from someone else and was starting to slip away. The mouth open in a silent O that suggested either mockery or hunger, or both. I jerked the wheel so hard the semi shuddered against the weight of the trailer. The dog let out a guttural growl that didn't sound like him at all. And in that second, the thing dropped to all fours, its hands splaying wide on the pavement, with fingers longer than they should be, eyes reflecting light in a way no human eye could. And then with a sickening lunge it cleared the yellow lines and vanished into the fog to my right. So smoothly it was as if the mist had opened a door for it. I slowed, heart battering my ribs like it wanted out, my breath sharp and unsteady while my boy stirred and mumbled, asking what happened, but my throat felt clamped shut because even saying the words would make them more real, and I just told him to go back to sleep, while my eyes darted from mirror to mirror. The dog's fur was up along his spine, his lips trembling back over his teeth, and his gaze fixed not ahead, but at the passenger side window, like something was pacing us just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination born of exhaustion, a figment born from monotony and road haze. But then I realized the air inside the cab was cold enough to see my breath despite the heater being on high, and I could hear it, a faint syncopated tapping like nails on metal, keeping pace with us on the other side of the door. My son shifted again, softer now, asking if someone was out there, and I couldn't lie because the fear in his tone carved straight into my chest, so I told him to stay very still and not look out the window, no matter what, and my own voice cracked in a way I haven't heard since I was a boy myself. The tapping grew louder, matched exactly with the acceleration when I pushed the pedal, a deliberate mimicry that told me it wasn't chasing us for hunger, but for the intimate sport of it. And every so often there was a scrape, like a palm dragging across the length of the cab, just light enough that I couldn't tell if it was inside or out. I thought about pulling over, but the image of that thing slithering out of the fog to meet me on the shoulder rooted my foot to the gas. The CB radio on the dash, dead for hours, crackled once, a burst of static so sudden it made the dog bark. But in the static was something almost like words, low and guttural, syllables bent wrong, as though someone was speaking through a throat not made for speech. I killed the radio, but the sound kept going for 3 more seconds from nowhere and everywhere at once. My mind was screaming to get off the highway, take an exit, find lights, people, anything. But the GPS told me the next town wasn't for 24 miles, and every mile felt like it was stretching longer in front of me, as though the road itself didn't want me to leave. The dog suddenly pressed himself against my leg and started whining under his breath, his nails scratching at the floor mat like he wanted to dig through it, and when I glanced down at him, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Not outside this time, but in the convex reflection of the driver's mirror. There was a figure clinging to the side of the trailer on all 4s, its head turned backwards toward the cab, smiling with lips that looked too tight around the teeth. My throat made a sound I didn't recognize, and I hit the accelerator hard enough that the engine roared, but the thing didn't let go. Instead, it pulled itself forward along the side of the trailer like a spider scaling a wall, closing the distance to my door inch by inch, and that was when the boy, ignoring my warning, turned to look directly at his window. His face went white, his hands clawed at the seatbelt, and he whispered something I could barely hear. But I think it was, "Dad, it has your face." I slammed the brakes without thinking, and the whole cab lurched forward. The rain had been falling in that steady, whispering way that makes the woods feel sentient, each drop like a fingertip against the cruiser roof, and at 2:46 a.m. the call came in from old Mr. Harden out on Ridge Hollow Road, his voice trembling through the static on my radio as he said something had gotten his dog, tore it to pieces right there in the yard, and though his words were jittery with age, there was something else threaded in, something like primal terror. So I headed out alone, tires hissing on the slick asphalt, spotlight sweeping over pine trunks that seemed to inch closer every time the beam slid past. The town was sleeping except for the storm and me, my thoughts crawling toward every case I had ever heard, whispered about but never seen, the kind they say only fools or outsiders try to write reports on. I turned onto Ridge Hollow and the rain thickened, the wipers barely keeping up, and the air inside the cruiser grew damp and cold enough that I could see my breath despite the defroster humming. Mr. Harden was waiting on his porch, lightless, just a shadow behind the screen door, his eyes wide and shining when I stepped out into the rain. He didn't come closer, just pointed toward the tree line and said it was still out there, that it was watching. I followed his gesture and my beam caught the carcass of his hound sprawled across the grass, fur matted black with rain and blood. The ribs split open in a way that spoke not of hunger, but of desecration, the entrails arranged in a spiral that felt deliberate, like something ancient and practiced had taken its time. I felt my stomach shift, but I kept my voice steady, telling him I'd have a look, and I moved toward the trees, the mud clutching at my boots, each step sending a faint suck into the night. The forest beyond was darker than it had any right to be, the stormlight somehow refusing to touch it, and as I stepped under the first boughs, the sound of the rain dulled as though the air itself had thickened. My flashlight beam quivered across the undergrowth, and that was when I heard it, a sound that should not have come from the throat of anything born on this earth, a sort of wet, elongated mimicry of a man calling sheriff, in a voice that was mine but not quite right, each syllable drawn too long, as though savoring how they tasted. He froze, the beam trembling against the brambles, and in that moment the woods smelled of copper and musk, like rusted iron steeped in wet fur. The voice came again, closer this time, still wearing my inflection, but warped with a hiss at the edges, and the hair rose along my neck as I realized it wasn't just calling, it was luring. The mud squelched somewhere to my right, slow, deliberate steps pacing me out of sight, and the dog in Mr. Harden's yard hadn't barked before it died, which meant whatever this was could silence a hound's instincts. I swung the beam toward the sound, and for a fraction of a second the light touched something pale between the trunks. 2 legs, too long, skin the color of milk gone bad, and the feet wrong somehow, like the toes were pointed behind it instead of forward. It moved back into shadow with a grace that was almost serpentine, and then the voice spoke again, only now. It was Harden's voice calling for help. So exact I almost turned to check on him until I remembered his screen door had never opened. The beam caught another glimpse. Hands thin and elongated, gripping the bark of a pine, but the fingers curling all the way around as if boneless, the nails black and wet. I backed toward the yard slowly, my hand on the butt of my sidearm, knowing full well that bullets wouldn't stop something like this, but clinging to the ritual of the motion like a child clutching a talisman. The voice switched again. Now it was the wet whimper of a dying animal, then my own again. Then my late father's voice whispering my name in a way he never had in life, and with each mimic the thing came closer until I could hear its breathing, low and uneven, as though it was savoring each lungful of my fear. The rain began to fall harder, the drops loud in the leaves above, yet I could hear something else threaded beneath it, a kind of faint chittering, almost too high for my ear to catch, and I realized with a cold clarity that there was more than one. I reached the edge of the yard and shouted for Harden to get inside, though my voice was trembling enough to betray me, and that was when the cruiser's radio crackled to life, though my hand was nowhere near it. Through the static came my voice, urgent and sharp, reporting my own death in precise detail, location, injuries, the works, and then cutting off in a burst of white noise that made my molars ache. Harden bolted his door without a word, and I stood in the rain, spotlight sweeping the tree line, and for just a moment I saw it fully step from the woods, tall enough that its head brushed the lowest branches, its skin stretched taut over bones that didn't belong in any anatomy book, its face a shifting ruin of features sliding over one another. The Smoky Mountains were breathing that night. You could feel it in the way the mist curled low over the treetops, like an animal watching from above. And we had been laughing by the fire, just the 3 of us, me and Ava and Claire, sharing wine in enamel mugs and listening to the distant rush of a creek that sounded like it had been flowing since before names existed. We had hiked all day, legs sore but spirits high, our little clearing tucked so far off the trail that even the cicadas seemed to hesitate before intruding, and when the embers began to die we decided to turn in, each of us slipping into the spacious canvas tent we had rented, thick sleeping bags unrolled across a quilt of pine needles and earth. The night was cool enough to see our breath if we spoke, and I remember Ava's hair spilling across my shoulder while Claire curled against my side, their warmth the only thing keeping me from focusing on how loud the forest seemed to have become. I drifted half asleep to the sound of crickets, only to jolt awake some time later to a stillness so absolute it was like the world had been muted. No insects, no creak, no wind, just the ringing in my own ears. Claire stirred and whispered if I had heard it too, but I asked her what she meant, and she said there had been footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to press into the earth and carry through the tent wall. I listened then, heart tightening in my chest, and sure enough, there it was, a wet crunch of leaves, then a pause, then another, each step closer until they stopped just outside the thin canvas. Ava's hand found mine in the dark, and I could feel the tension in her grip as though she were holding back the urge to scream. I cleared my throat and called out, asking if someone was there, my voice cracking in a way I hated, and what answered was not words, but my own voice repeating the question back to me perfectly, even down to the quiver, only slower, like it wanted to savor the syllables. My skin went cold and I fumbled for the flashlight, its beam cutting through the tent, in sharp white and spilling out the flap where the zipper had been left just slightly undone. We stared toward the gap and saw the shadow of legs, too long, too thin, standing there utterly still, pointed toward us in a way that made me feel dissected. Then it crouched and the shape of its head appeared in the opening, not entering, just watching. And in that brief moment before I killed the light, I saw a face that looked almost human. Except the eyes were wrong, too reflective, too deep, and the mouth was stretched in a way that suggested it was unused to wearing such a shape. We sat in darkness after that, breathing shallow, not daring to move, and then from the far side of the tent came Ava's voice telling me to come outside, soft and coaxing. Only Ava was still pressed against me, shaking. Claire whimpered under her breath, and the thing laughed, a wet, broken imitation of amusement that made bile rise in my throat. I told them to stay inside while I reached for the hatchet by my bag, though every instinct screamed at me not to leave, and when I unzipped the flap, the clearing was empty. Moonlight painting everything silver except the tree line, where something pale slipped behind a trunk in utter silence. I stepped out slowly, eyes sweeping the woods, ears straining, and caught the smell then, coppery, feral, like wet fur left to rot. It called again from somewhere to my right in Claire's voice, now pleading, panicked, saying something had grabbed her, which would have been convincing if she had not been clinging to Ava inside the tent. I tightened my grip on the hatchet and backed toward the fire pit where the last embers glowed dull red, thinking fire might help, thinking anything might help, but the embers hissed out as though snuffed by unseen hands, and the dark surged in around me. The mimicry shifted again. Now it was my mother's voice from when I was a child, soft and loving, telling me it was safe to come to her. And for a moment my knees weakened, because some deep part of me wanted to believe it. Then I heard the movement above, branches groaning under a weight that should not have been able to climb. And when I shone the light up, it was there, clinging upside down to a limb, its limbs spider-like, its head turning too far to watch me with that glistening smile. Before I could react, it dropped soundlessly to the ground between me and the tent, its height forcing it to stoop, its skin twitching as though alive with things beneath it, and in the beam of the light its eyes seemed to tunnel straight into mine, showing me images I cannot unsee. Fields of bones, faces peeled away like masks, hunters older than language. It moved toward me in slow, measured steps and spoke again in my own voice, saying, "Run," before smiling wider and adding, "You will not get far." I stumbled back, tripped over a root, and when I looked up, it was gone. Mom and Dad left Friday afternoon for their anniversary trip to Savannah, leaving me and my twin brother Caleb to hold down the house for the weekend. Pause. And it felt like a harmless arrangement. We were 18, practically adults, and the weather was cool enough to keep the windows open without the hum of the AC. Friday night passed easy, just movies and pizza and laughing until 2 in the morning. Slow down slightly. But Saturday, long pause. Saturday changed everything. I woke to the sound of scratching at the back door just before 3, that deliberate scrape of something hard dragging across wood, slower, lower pitch. And I thought maybe it was a raccoon until the sound stopped at the moment I sat up. Caleb was already awake, his eyes wide in the dim hallway light, and he whispered he had been hearing it for 10 minutes straight. Whisper, scrape, pause, scrape. Normal pace. So we crept toward the kitchen, bare feet silent on the tile, and the moonlight spilling through the glass panes above the door showed something that made my skin tighten, elongate slowly. A silhouette of a man standing on the porch, completely still, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly toward the door. I reached for the handle out of reflex, but Caleb grabbed my wrist so hard his nails dug in, and that was when the figure stepped closer. Pause, whisper, and we heard our mother's voice say, "Open the door," boys in that sweet tone she always used when waking us for school. Pause. Except our parents were 5 hours away, Caleb whispered through clenched teeth to turn off the kitchen light, and the moment we did, the figure leaned forward, so its face was inches from the glass, its features pale and stretched like wet paper over bone, its eyes shining with an unnatural reflection that shifted colors. It spoke again in Mom's voice, only slower, elongating the vowels like it was tasting them. Elongate, mockingly. "Boys, open up." Quieter, fast-pacing. We backed down the hall and locked ourselves in our room, hearts pounding so loud it felt like they'd draw it closer. The scratching started again, but now from the side of the house, then the front, then above us on the roof. Each scrape deliberate, measured, like it wanted us to know exactly where it was. We killed every light and sat with our backs against the wall facing the door, my phone in my hand trembling as I tried to call Dad. But the call kept failing. No signal, just a soft burst of static in my ear that sounded almost like someone breathing. Caleb mouthed something at me and pointed to the window by his bed, the blinds shifting, though there was no wind. And when I leaned just enough to peek through the slats, I saw it standing in the yard under the oak tree. Only now it looked exactly like Caleb. Pause for emphasis. Same hoodie, same messy hair, same way he shoved his hands in his pockets, except the arms were too long, and the grin was wrong, far too wide. It looked up at me, tilted its head, and mouthed my name in a slow, exaggerated way, before running toward the house on all fours with an inhuman speed that made my stomach flip. Fast, urgent tone. I yanked the blinds shut, and Caleb and I braced against the door, just as something hit it hard enough to rattle the frame, but then there was silence. No footsteps, no breathing, just the heavy hush of the house around us. Minutes dragged like hours until we heard the front door open, whisper, drawn out, creak, and close again. Then, pause. My voice calling from the living room, calm and casual, telling Caleb to come out and bring me with him, low menacing tone. It sounded exactly like me, except there was a strange clicking under the words, like teeth snapping lightly together. Caleb squeezed my arm and shook his head, but the voice kept calling, closer each time, until it was right outside the bedroom door. The knob turned slowly, but didn't open, and then the voice whispered through the crack that it knew we were scared, and it liked that. Slow, deliberate pace. The floor creaked as it moved away, and for a moment I thought it was over, until I realized it hadn't gone far. Now there were 2 sets of footsteps circling the house in opposite directions, and every so often one of them would stop and tap on the glass with something sharp. The tapping got faster, then slower, then stopped altogether, and Caleb leaned close and whispered that he could hear breathing under the bed. Pause. Quiet rising tension. I lowered myself to the floor, heart in my throat, and peered into the dark space beneath, elongate slightly, and saw my own face staring back at me from less than a foot away, grinning in the dark, its eyes wide and glistening like wet obsidian. It whispered my name in perfect unison with the other me outside. Slight whisper with rising pitch, and then they both laughed, that same warped, broken sound coming from 2 directions at once. Caleb pulled me back against the wall, and we just sat there, not daring to move, not daring to breathe, until we heard the front door open again, and a voice we both recognized as Dad's calling out. I had been looking forward to that hike for months, just me and Jasper, my old Labrador, escaping the noise of the city for the quiet expanse of the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachian wilderness. The morning air was cool enough to bite at my cheeks, the kind of crisp that makes each breath feel sharper, cleaner. And the trail was bathed in a honeyed glow from the early sun, filtering through leaves the color of rust and gold. Jasper trotted ahead, tail swaying like a metronome, his nails ticking softly against the packed dirt as we climbed higher into the trees. I had studied the map, checked the weather, packed enough food and water for 2 days, and even brought the compass my father had given me years ago. But pause, somewhere along the ridgeline, the trail began to feel wrong. The markers I'd been following vanished, swallowed by dense thickets, and when I tried to double back, I found only unfamiliar bends and shadowed hollows. I told myself not to panic, but the sky had shifted to a muted grey, and the wind carried a strange undercurrent of scent, coppery, feral, like the tang of blood left too long in the air. Jasper had gone still beside me, ears high, body taut, his gaze fixed into the tree line, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. Lower, slower. That was when I heard it, my own voice calling my name from somewhere ahead, low and drawn out, as though spoken through a mouth that wasn't used to the shape of the words. I froze, every hair on my arms lifting, and Jasper gave a deep, guttural growl I had never heard from him before. I called out a sharp and foolish reflex, and the voice answered instantly from much closer this time, warmer, almost coaxing. Whisper. Come here. You're safe. Pause, but the sound had a wet undertone to it, a faint clicking between syllables that made my stomach knot. I gripped the hatchet from my pack and moved forward slowly, scanning the brush, hard with the kind of heavy percussion you feel in your teeth. The woods had gone silent. No bird calls, no rustle of leaves, just that distant click, click, click between the trees. We emerged into a small clearing, and that was when I saw it. Elongate. At first I thought it was a man, standing tall and still against the edge of the brush, but its legs were too long, its arms hanging almost to its knees, the hands pale and wrong with fingers bending too far back, its head tilted slowly, and I felt a sickness slide into me as I saw my own face staring back, smiling faintly, its eyes reflecting the light in a way that made them look hollow. Jasper lunged forward, barking furiously, but the thing moved with a sudden predatory grace, dropping to all fours in a motion too fluid for anything human and circling us with a speed that made my vision swim. It spoke again, in my father's voice this time, calling me son in that exact tone from childhood, yet the edges of the words curled into something mocking. I backed toward the opposite tree line, Jasper at my side, hatchet shaking in my grip, and every step I took it matched, staying just far enough away that I could not strike. Quietly, then it stood upright again and began to mimic Jasper's bark, perfectly at first, then slower, deeper, until it was something else entirely, something guttural and wrong. The sound froze Jasper in place, his ears flattening as though some instinct older than both of us told him this was not prey, not predator, something outside the rules entirely. I forced myself to run, branches whipping against my arms, the ground uneven beneath my boots, and I didn't dare look back, though I could hear it pacing me in the brush, each footfall perfectly timed to mine. I stumbled over a root and hit the ground hard, knocking the wind from my lungs, and before I could rise, Jasper threw himself over me, snarling at something behind us. I turned and saw it less than 10 feet away, that distorted version of me crouched low, its mouth stretching open far too wide, showing rows of teeth that seemed to recede into darkness. Its skin shivered as though something was moving beneath it, and then it whispered my name again, so close it felt like the sound was inside my skull. Slower. I swung the hatchet with every ounce of strength I had, and it slipped back into the trees as though melting into them, vanishing in the span of a blink. The forest went silent again, except for my own ragged breaths and Jasper's low growl. I got to my feet and started moving in the direction I prayed would take us back to the trail, never loosening my grip on the hatchet, never letting Jasper out of arm's reach. Pause. But the woods didn't feel empty now. They felt aware, as though every tree was leaning just slightly toward us, every shadow a little too patient. An hour later, I saw the trail marker ahead and nearly collapsed with relief until I noticed Jasper had stopped cold behind me, his eyes locked on the path we had just come from. Soft, whispered. That was when I heard it again. My voice perfect this time, cool and steady, calling Jasper's name from somewhere. We had booked the place on a whim one rainy Thursday night. Lit only by the blue glow of my laptop screen, the Airbnb description promised rustic charm, secluded tranquility, and a hot tub overlooking the pines of rural North Carolina. And for a weekend away from the smog and neon of the city, it sounded perfect. We packed a few clothes, a cooler stuffed with snacks, a mason jar of weed, and a Bluetooth speaker, and hit the road by noon on Friday. The cabin was about 20 minutes from the nearest gas station, and the gravel road that led us there was narrow enough that if a car had been coming the other way, we would have had to reverse a quarter-mile to let it pass. The place itself looked postcard-worthy, warm light from the windows pooling across a wooden porch, the smell of pine resin sharp in the air, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has forgotten you. And we laughed at that, because we wanted to be forgotten. We settled in quick joints, rolled before our bags were unpacked, the stereo low, the air thick with sweet smoke. We wandered barefoot through the cabin, discovering quirks, like the way one floorboard in the hallway moaned under the lightest step, and how the bathroom mirror was old enough that it slightly warped your reflection, and as night fell the temperature dropped hard. The woods outside seemed to swell darker, deeper, as if every branch and shadow pressed closer. We stayed on the porch for a while, watching mist thread itself between the trunks, until something snapped out there sharp and deliberate. Not a branch breaking in the wind, but the wet crack of bone. We froze, exchanged a look, the joint burning down to nothing in my hand. I told myself it was deer. I had read somewhere that deer made odd sounds at night, sometimes even screams, but the sound came again this time, followed by a noise so alien and almost human. My chest tightened like a vice. It was high and low at once, as though something was trying to mimic speech, but didn't quite know how. We retreated inside, locking the door, because that seemed like the thing to do, though the rational part of me whispered that a simple lock wouldn't mean much out here. We tried to shake it off, put on a movie sprawled on the couch, and let the flicker of the screen pretend to be safety. But at some point, the scratching started from underneath the floor, faint at first, a dry, dragging scrape that came and went like breath. We leaned over the edge of the couch and peered at the shadowed seam where floor met wall, but saw nothing. I told her. Maybe it was raccoons, but the sound moved too slowly, too purposefully, as if whatever it was knew exactly where we were seated. I killed the movie, and the silence after was unbearable. Our breathing seemed too loud. I swear I could hear hers quickening. Then the scratching stopped and was replaced by the sound of footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate stepping in the cabin. Porch boards creaked and my stomach turned ice. We stared at each other, unmoving, until something knocked on the door 3 times, slow measured each knock, followed by stillness. She whispered that maybe it was the owner checking in, but when I looked out the side window, there was nothing but darkness and the vague shifting of shapes between the trees. Then a voice called my name clear as hers, but it wasn't hers. It was wrong, stretched in a way that made my ears feel hot and my skin crawl. Every instinct screamed that it was not human and not safe, but it kept calling almost playfully, and I realized it was circling the cabin while saying my name, each syllable wet with an imitation of laughter. The dog across the road began barking and then yelped high and pitiful before going silent. Something thudded against the far wall of the cabin, hard enough to rattle a picture frame. We backed into the bedroom, the only room with 2 windows, and I grabbed the only thing I had for defense, a kitchen knife with a blade barely longer than my hand. We kept the lights off. Crouching low, the woods outside seemed alive now, restless shapes moving between trees, but never fully revealing themselves. I caught a glimpse of something pale, too tall, too thin, gliding just beyond the reach of the moonlight, its joints bending wrong, as though they had learned about human anatomy from a description rather than experience. My pulse was a drum in my ears. I tried to convince myself this was a bad trip from the weed, but the air tasted of copper and decay, and my body knew what my brain wouldn't admit. Then, from the far window came her voice, my girlfriend's voice, pleading for me to come outside, her tone trembling in a way that made my heart twist, except she was right beside me in the dark. Clutching my arm so tight her nails drew blood. The thing outside kept speaking in her voice, but the words were scrambled out of order like a child retelling a dream. Then it went quiet, and that silence was somehow worse. I realized too late that the other window was open by an inch, the curtains shifting just slightly, as if something had brushed them. We had driven an hour past the last flicker of cell service, down a narrow road that dissolved into dirt before vanishing entirely into the whispering canopy, the kind of forest where every trunk seemed to lean in to listen. The lake was a secret passed between locals in half-muttered warnings, and we knew we should have taken those seriously. But it was August, the air heavy and damp, and the promise of cool water was too tempting. So we parked where the ground turned soft and carried our towels through the underbrush until the trees suddenly parted to reveal a mirror of dark green water that looked almost black where the depth swallowed the light. No houses, no docks, not even a canoe pulled up on the bank. Just the quiet hum of cicadas and the faint smell of moss. We stripped to swimsuits and ran in with the reckless cadence of people who think they own their lives. The water was warm at the edges, but colder as we swam further out until the shore had shrunk to a distant smear behind us, and the silence here felt stranger, heavier, as if sound itself hesitated to exist in the middle of this place. We treaded water, laughing too loudly to hide the unease already curling between us, and that were when the sky shifted so suddenly it was as if a shadow had been pulled across the sun. A gust of wind dragged a ripple over the lake's surface, and with it came the first cool drops of rain, fat and deliberate, then more until it was pouring in thick diagonal sheets. The kind of rain that makes the air taste metallic and ancient. Thunder rolled close enough to shiver through our ribs, and lightning illuminated the whole lake for a blink of a second. And in that moment, I saw something ahead of us breaking the water. Not far away. It was not a log, not a fish. It was a shape too tall, too deliberate, and when its head turned toward us, I realized it was neither animal nor human. The water clung to it unnaturally, as though reluctant to release whatever it was its limbs. Too long, its movement unnervingly smooth, even in the churning storm. My friends saw it too. One of them cursed under his breath and started swimming for shore. But the thing moved in his direction with a slow certainty, like it had already chosen. Who would be first? The rain became deafening, hammering the surface until each drop seemed to shatter against us. We tried to stay together, but the cold and the panic made us clumsy. The creature closed the distance without breaking its unnatural rhythm, each stroke of its arms too fluid, too precise, and then it spoke or tried till the voice came warped and hollow, as though the lake itself had learned to imitate sound. It said my name once, twice, then again, but wrong, like it was tasting the syllables rather than saying them. Every instinct screamed not to answer, but the sound burrowed into my mind until I almost forgot how to keep swimming. Another flash of lightning, and I saw its face clearly, or what passed for a face, smooth pale, and stretched over a skull that didn't match human proportions. The eyes were black voids rimmed with something like frost, and its mouth was too wide, the corners splitting further when it grinned. My friend reached the shallows, and I thought he was safe until the water beneath him surged upward in a spray, and something yanked him under so quickly that the splash seemed delayed by the act itself. I screamed, but it was lost in the roar of the storm. The other friend was now ahead of me, and I could hear his ragged breaths as he pushed toward shore until his voice changed mid-breath, becoming a wet rasp that wasn't his own. I looked and saw another shape in the water parallel to him, impossibly fast, and when it rose just enough for the rain to run down its face, I realized it was wearing his features, except the eyes were still that same consuming black. The shore was only yards away, but the water felt thicker, heavier, harder to move through, like it wanted to keep me. I forced myself forward until I could feel mud under my feet, and I didn't stop until my knees hit sand. I turned expecting to see both friends behind me, but there was only one standing in the shallow, the rain slicking his hair to his forehead and his lips curling into that same too wide smile. The real one was gone. I knew it before my mind could accept it. The thing in the water tilted its head in a way that felt more like study than malice. Then it stepped forward just enough for one foot to break the surface onto the sand, and that was when the thunder cracked so loud the trees shook, and I swear the air itself whispered something that did not belong to any language I knew. The storm swallowed the sound, but the meaning clung to me like wet cloth, and I realized in that moment there are things in this world older than our names and hungrier than our fears, and they do not need to chase you. Once they know, you will always hear them whispering in the rain. The wind outside clawed at the siding with a persistence that felt almost sentient, a low keening that rose and fell, like something breathing just beyond the walls. And I remember thinking how Minnesota winters could make you hear things that weren't there, when the snow came heavy and the world outside your window turned into a pale, empty void, the horizon swallowed by the blizzard's cataract veil. Tonight was one of those nights when the temperature had dropped so far past freezing that the air itself seemed brittle, a night when people with sense locked their doors, stoked their fires and waited for the wind to lose interest. But I was alone, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor in a house my uncle had left me when he died last spring, a house that creaked in the bones when it settled as if sighing from some deep and ancient fatigue. I had been reading in the den, an old armchair angled toward the frosted window, a single lamp pooling amber light around me when I heard the first sound from outside, a muffled thud, not sharp like a branch falling but dull and deliberate, as if something heavy had stepped down into the snow. I froze. Book halfway closed, listening with a stillness that seemed to stretch the room until I heard it again, closer this time, a cadence in the steps that felt off, too slow, too measured, too listening. There was no reason anyone should be out here in this weather. The county road would be impassable by now, and the drifts were already high enough to swallow your knees. Still, I told myself it could be a deer, or maybe the neighbor's dog, gone wandering until I realized the pattern of steps had changed, now accompanied by a faint scraping sound like claws or perhaps fingers trailing along the siding. I turned off the lamp immediately, the sudden dark making the window's black square seem vaster, more absolute. I waited in that lightless silence, the only sound my own breathing, until there came 3 knocks against the wall directly below the window where I sat, not loud but precise, 3 evenly spaced raps that made my chest feel too small for my heart. I stood slowly, careful not to let the chair legs groan against the floorboards, and backed into the hallway where the shadows clung thicker. Then from the kitchen came the sound of the back door handle testing itself, a slow metallic click followed by a pause, as if whatever was out there was gauging my reaction. My uncle had told me once, half joking, that you didn't want to meet the things that walked when the snow was white enough to hide their feet, and his eyes had held that sort of jest that isn't entirely jest. Then the handle turned again, harder this time, and the door rattled against its frame. I grabbed the hunting rifle from the rack in the hall, though I doubted it would matter against whatever felt wrong in my gut, and stepped toward the kitchen, the storm's howl louder here, as if the wind was trying to warn me or egg me on. Then a voice called my name, clear and crisp through the door. But it was my mother's voice, and my mother was dead. It spoke again, adding the exact inflection she used when she was annoyed with me as a child, and for a moment my legs wanted to move toward it before reason forced me still. I whispered to myself that it wasn't her, that it couldn't be, that nothing good calls to you in a blizzard wearing someone else's mouth. The voice shifted then, lower, deeper, like someone trying on tones to see which one fit best. And in that warped syllable I heard hunger, not for food, but for something it thought I had. The handle stilled, and I thought it had gone until the knock came again. This time at the front door on the opposite side of the house, fast, almost playful. I backed down the hallway toward my bedroom where I could lock the door, but then I heard it inside, the floorboards in the living room groaning under a weight heavier than mine, a sound that seemed to seep rather than travel, like it was coming from everywhere at once. I slammed my bedroom door and locked it, pressing my back to the cold wood, rifle trembling in my hands. The breathing came next, soft at first, just on the other side of the door, then closer until it felt like it was just above my ear, whispering something in a language I didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. A promise that it would come in whether I let it or not. Then a long pause as the silence pressed in, and I realized with sinking certainty that the breathing had stopped, because it was already in the room. I turned my head so slowly it felt like the air itself had thickened, and in the dim shape of my dresser mirror, I saw the reflection of something standing behind me, too tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, its arms hanging at its sides in a way that suggested they could be longer if it wanted them to be. Its face was my face, but stretched thin, as though it had been pulled over something else entirely, its eyes black and glistening like frozen tar. And when it smiled, the corners of the mouth didn't stop. I had been in the surveying business long enough to understand that solitude was an occupational constant, but nothing about that Tuesday in late September prepared me for the solitude I would meet in that remote valley. The sky was brooding when I arrived, clouds roiling like the belly of some immense unseen beast. The wind smelled of ozone and damp earth, a promise of rain hanging heavy on the air. And though the road had been a teeth-rattling labyrinth of potholes and muck, I welcomed the isolation for its own strange serenity. The terrain here was difficult steep slopes layered in stubborn underbrush and pine trunks that groaned in the wind as if they too bore witness to something ancient and patient. Watching from afar as I marked my first coordinates, a thin drizzle began tapping my hard hat, a sound delicate but insistent like fingernails drumming from some hidden place. It thickened without warning, to a cold, slanting rain soaking my jacket in seconds and forcing me to hunch over my notepad. I muttered at the weather and kept moving, each squelching step pulling at my boots as though the earth itself wanted me to stay. I told myself the flicker in the tree line to my right was just a branch dancing in the gusts, but the way it stilled precisely when I stopped made my mouth go dry. Thunder rumbled from somewhere distant, yet close enough to vibrate in my ribs, then silence but for the rain and the faint whine of wind through needles. I set my tripod, adjusting the lens and sight line, but as the focus cleared my chest, constricted, there was something just beyond the ridge, a shape, not quite man, not quite animal, impossibly still in the sheets of falling water, its limbs too long, its head cocked in a way that suggested both curiosity and predation. Lightning cracked above, and for a fraction of a second the landscape lit in surgical detail, revealing skin stretched thin and pale over bones, eyes like molten glass fixed on me, then darkness again. The sound of rain seemed to vanish in that moment, leaving only my heartbeat an erratic metronome in the void. I blinked hard-wiped water from my face, but the ridge was empty now, or appeared to be. The wind gusted again, carrying with it a voice that was not a voice, something rasping. My name drawn out and wavering like it was learning to speak with a mouth unused to language. I wanted to believe it was just the storm, manipulating sound through the trees, yet I could feel the words in my bones. Not my ears. I began packing with hands clumsy and cold. But each time I glanced up, there was movement at the periphery, always vanishing. Before my eyes could catch it, I hurried toward the truck. The rain now pounding so hard it stung the back of my neck. Puddles forming in seconds beneath my feet. Thunder cracked again, and this time in that instant of blinding light, the figure was closer. Much closer. Halfway down the slope, its posture bent forward, its limbs moving in the wrong rhythm for any natural gait, its joints bending too far and too slow, as if resisting some invisible tether. I stumbled in the mud, my gear spilling into the muck, but I didn't stop to retrieve it. My only thought was the truck, the locked doors, the safety of steel and glass. But the rational part of me kept whispering that steel and glass were nothing to whatever this thing was. I reached the clearing where my truck waited and froze, because there it was at the driver's side door, one elongated hand resting on the handle, its head slowly turning toward me, and in the intermittent lightning flashes, I saw its lips pull back in a smile that was not human, and yet knew perfectly well what a smile meant. My keys were in my pocket, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely grip them, and in that eternal second between thunder and lightning, it began to walk toward me each step, somehow silent against the sucking mud its eyes locked on mine. With such unbearable persistence, I felt my knees weaken. I got into the truck, slammed, the locks down, turned the ignition with a choke of breath, but as the headlights flared, they illuminated only an empty road before me and an empty clearing behind. And yet as I drove away faster than prudence allowed, the rain hammering the windshield so hard it blurred the world, I could still hear it whisper my name from somewhere impossibly close, and it was not until I was miles away that I realized the voice was now inside the cab with me, and it spoke with the intimacy of someone who had been standing at my shoulder for far longer than I dared to imagine. Sometimes solitude is not the absence of company, but the presence of something you wish had stayed away forever. It was supposed to be a simple evening, just me and the Bennets' old two-story farmhouse, with their daughters Lila and Sophie, who were both already in pajamas when their parents left for a dinner an hour away outside. The wind muttered in the eaves and the trees groaned against one another in that hollow way that makes you think of deep empty woods, far from the human eyes, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth. The girls were upstairs watching a movie when I heard what I thought was the front door clicking open. My first thought was the storm, pushing at old hinges, so I went to check, whispering to myself in the way people do when they want to convince their brain there's nothing wrong, but the lock was still bolted and the porch was empty. Rain was starting to patter, the kind that seems to come from all directions at once. I was halfway back to the stairs when I heard a voice calling my name, low, flat, and too deliberate. It was Sophie's voice, but it came from outside the front door. My skin went cold. I glanced up the stairs and Sophie leaned over the railing, smiling a little, confused, asking if I needed something. I forced a laugh and said no, then told them to stay upstairs, but my stomach had tightened into a stone. My ears kept straining against the sound of rain, trying to catch the edges of that voice again. And when it came, the second time, it was closer, more assured, as though whoever or whatever it was had confirmed my name was correct. I locked every door and checked the windows, all the while trying to keep my breathing quiet enough that the girls wouldn't hear me moving faster than I wanted them to hear. The wind began to gust harder, the rain slapping the siding in short, vicious bursts like fingers drumming impatiently against hollow wood. When the power flickered, I froze, the sound of the television upstairs, muting for an instant. Then stuttering back to life was almost enough to ground me, until I noticed that one of the living room curtains was shifting slightly. The window behind it was unlatched. I know I locked it earlier. I pulled it shut, my hands, trembling when something brushed the outside glass. It wasn't a hand or a branch. The shape was wrong, elongated and curling slightly, like it was trying to mimic fingers. Without quite understanding the anatomy, my chest constricted, and I whispered to myself again, trying to create some illusion of control. But the voice outside whispered back, repeating the cadence exactly like it was feeding it through some imperfect echo chamber. I backed toward the stairs, thinking of nothing but getting to the girls, but halfway up I heard Lila scream. I bolted into the room, and they were both standing in the corner, eyes wide and fixed on the closet door, which was open just a crack. I told them to stay behind me and cross the room, but the closer I got, the more wrong the air felt, thickening, almost syrupy. My legs heavy, my hearing muffled except for a slow, wet breathing coming from the darkness within. I reached for the handle, and the breathing stopped, utterly replaced by my own voice calling to the girls, telling them to come here, telling them it was safe in a tone that was almost right, but not quite. I yanked the door open, and the closet was empty except for the faintest smell of iron and something like rot. The window on the far wall stood wide open, curtains blowing inward as rain splattered the carpet. I slammed it shut, but the instant I turned around, Sophie was gone. I grabbed Lila's wrist and dragged her downstairs, shouting for Sophie, my voice breaking. Though part of me knew it was useless. Then from the kitchen came the sound of Sophie's giggle. The light flickered again, and for a moment the room was swallowed in near darkness. When it came back there, she was standing in the middle of the kitchen, but wrong. Her limbs too long, her head tilted too far, her smile stretching just past where human skin should split her eyes. Black like wet pits in the earth she spoke, but her lips hardly moved. My name poured from her in that same broken cadence, and I could feel it in my bones that this was not Sophie. The real Sophie's voice echoed faintly from somewhere deeper in the house, crying my name, pleading. I stepped forward, but the thing stepped too in perfect imitation, its shoulders twitching in small, unnatural jerks like it was testing the limits of its frame. Thunder cracked, the windows rattled, and the lights died completely, leaving only the storm's silver flicker to show me its silhouette. It began to move around the counter, slow, deliberate, predatory, and with each step its shape seemed to unravel and reform like smoke, trying to remember the body it was wearing. Lila clung to my arm so hard her nails cut into my skin, whispering over and over that she wanted her mum, and every instinct I had screamed to run, but my legs refused. The creature stopped just a few feet away, and in that awful stillness I realized it was listening not to me, but to something outside above the rain's din, like it was waiting for permission to attack.
If you enjoyed the journey and survived it, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who sleeps too easily, and subscribe for more original horror stories delivered straight into your nightmares. And if you have a true tale or twisted idea you'd like me to bring to life, leave it in the comments below. I read them all. Some of my favorite stories come from minds just like yours. And so the final candle is burned out, but some stories never really end. They wait in the corners of your mind, and now so must you. You have heard the incantations of the demised, the shadows sworn to secrecy. But what slipped through, what followed you back into the light, if these stories stirred something inside you, if they made you hesitate before turning off the lights, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because next time, we're going deeper. So rest while you can, because next time the story just might be about you.